Hi, I know I'm just a cat, but I believe in kindness. If you click subscribe under this video, you'll make my day.
When my mother raised her wine glass and let that sharp little smile stretch across her face, the kind of smile that always meant someone was about to get humiliated under the guise of humor, I already knew how the evening was going to end. "To my favorite child," she said, her voice sweet like syrup but twice as sticky and poisonous. "The one worth celebrating." The guests laughed, thinking it was all just a cute moment of motherly affection. My sister Emma blushed and gave a modest shrug, playing the role she'd always been cast in Golden Daughter, favorite child, angel in human form. I didn't laugh. I didn't even blink. I just stood up, walked across the room in my plain navy dress that no one complimented, and handed my mother the envelope I'd been carrying for weeks. "Then this must be yours," I said, not loud, not angry, just matter of fact. She opened it, right there, without hesitation, and the moment her eyes hit the first line, her smile cracked like porcelain. The room went silent. That awful kind of silence, when everyone knows they've just witnessed something irreversible, but no one knows whose side to be on yet. But to understand why I did what I did, you'd have to know what it's like to live your whole life in second place. Not just second place in school or sports or careers, no, that's ordinary. I mean second place in your own family, where birthdays feel like obligations, praise is rationed like war food, and every achievement you fight for is somehow just not quite good enough. I'm Jenna Collins, 43 years old, single, no kids, divorced after 8 years of trying to force a marriage that never really fit. I work in a pediatric clinic in St. Louis, and I love my job, even though it's emotionally exhausting. I never planned on having kids, mostly because I spent too much of my own childhood raising myself. It's hard to sign up for that kind of emotional risk again when the people who were supposed to love you unconditionally made you feel like you were some draft version of someone better. My mother, Margaret, is one of those women people describe as elegant, or sharp, or well-preserved, all those coded words that mean she's controlling, critical, and too proud to admit she ever made a mistake. She had 2 daughters, me and Emma, and from the moment Emma arrived, it was clear to everyone who the sun shined brighter on. Emma was blonde, soft-spoken, and adorable even when she was being a brat. I was darker-haired, serious, and according to Mom, too intense. That was her favorite critique of me, by the way, intense. As if my problem was that I felt too much, not that she never tried to understand any of it. Emma could lie, cheat, or cry her way out of anything, and Mom would either excuse it or spin it into some tragic misunderstanding. Meanwhile, I could get straight A's, help with chores, stay out of trouble, and somehow I was still the one being told to work on your attitude. I used to think maybe I'd done something wrong as a baby, like I'd cried too much or not been cute enough, and I carried that belief deep into adulthood, quietly asking myself what I'd done to earn her resentment. It took me over 30 years to realize that maybe it had nothing to do with me. The moment I started noticing the favoritism, I was probably about 8 years old. Emma had drawn on the wall with red crayon, some wild scribble that looked like a demon with pigtails. My mother walked in, saw the mess, and immediately turned to me. "Jenna, what did you do?" I remember pointing at Emma, who was standing right there with the crayon still in her hand. But Margaret refused to believe it. "Don't lie," she snapped. "You're better than this." I got grounded for 2 weeks and had to scrub the wall while Emma got dessert. That memory never left me, not because of the punishment, but because of the message. Truth didn't matter, not if it didn't fit her narrative. Growing up in that house meant learning to read the room with surgical precision. You had to know when Margaret's mood shifted, when a joke was actually an insult, when silence was punishment. I adapted. I got good at observing, anticipating, blending in. I didn't cause waves. I got into nursing school, got a stable job, married a man who seemed safe, and tried to keep things calm. But underneath all of that was a slow simmering rage that I never fully understood, not until the day I found the letter. It was in a box marked Dad's Tools, up in the attic of the old family house after Margaret asked me to help clear out some of the junk before the birthday party. She didn't want to get dusty, of course, so she sent me up there alone. The air was thick and musty, and the insulation was peeling like scabs. I opened an old wooden box looking for wrenches and instead found a yellowed envelope with my name written on it in my dad's handwriting. He died 8 years ago, a quiet, good man who always seemed sad, like he was carrying a weight he couldn't put down. I opened the letter sitting on a splintered wooden beam, not expecting anything more than maybe a sentimental note or some fatherly advice he never got to say. What I got instead was a truth I never asked for, one that explained everything. It wasn't long, maybe 2 pages, but by the end, my stomach had turned cold. My dad wrote that he always loved both of us, but he knew Emma wasn't his biological daughter. He found out after she was born, and Margaret begged him to stay and raise her like his own. He agreed, but it broke him. He said he didn't tell anyone because he didn't want us girls to suffer, but he also knew that Margaret's guilt had twisted her, that she overcompensated with Emma and resented me for being a daily reminder of her lie. I sat there in the attic, staring at the words, the pieces finally clicking together like a cruel puzzle. That was the moment the anger stopped simmering. It boiled. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just folded the letter, took a deep breath, and said to myself, this changes everything. Because it did. It made my whole damn life make sense in a way that was almost worse than if it had just been random cruelty. At least random cruelty isn't personal. That night, I didn't sleep. I made copies of the letter. I searched my father's old emails and handwriting samples. I found a notary to verify his signature. I contacted a lawyer I knew through work, just in case. And then I started writing my own notes, short, clear, and stapled to the back of Dad's words. Truth should never be buried. I didn't plan on confronting her at the party. Not at first. But when I stood there and heard her toast Emma like she was the only reason this family was worth celebrating, I realized something. The truth isn't just about justice. Sometimes, it's about reclaiming your voice after a lifetime of being told to stay quiet. And so, I handed her the envelope. Let the silence fall. Let the truth begin. There's a kind of silence that doesn't bring peace. It doesn't soothe or comfort. It just stretches, taut and suffocating over your skin, like the moment just before a storm breaks open, when the air is too heavy and your breath catches in your throat without warning. That was the silence that filled me after I read the letter, not just because of what it said, but because I suddenly understood that my entire life had been shaped by something I was never even allowed to know. Something that was kept hidden like a mold behind the drywall, spreading quietly, ruining the foundation while everyone pretended the house was fine. The envelope had been unassuming, yellowed at the corners, slightly brittle with age, and the ink on the front had faded just enough that I had to hold it up to the dim attic light to read my name clearly, Jenna, in my dad's careful, almost timid handwriting. The kind of script that belonged to a man who never raised his voice, who made lists for everything, who kept his disappointments folded up inside himself like old receipts. There was something ceremonial about opening it, like I was doing something sacred and dangerous all at once, and as soon as I unfolded those 2 pages, the air changed, or maybe I just did. My father's words weren't angry. They weren't even bitter. They were quiet, almost apologetic, written in the tone of someone who had carried a weight far too long and had no strength left to pretend it hadn't been slowly killing him. He started by telling me he loved me, that much. He repeated more than once, and that if I was reading the letter, it meant Margaret had either finally told the truth or, more likely, she never did, and I had found it by accident. He said he always suspected I would be the one to discover it, that I had my mother's sharp instincts, but none of her cruelty, and that he hoped what he wrote would give me clarity, even if it didn't offer comfort. Then he laid it all out. Emma was not his daughter. She had been conceived during a 6-month separation early in his marriage to Margaret, during a time when he had been working long hours, trying to pay off hospital bills from my birth, and Margaret had gone to find herself at her sister's house in Denver. She came back pregnant. She swore it was his. He believed her, or maybe he just wanted to believe her badly enough that it didn't matter. But when Emma was born, blonde-haired, blue-eyed, with nothing of his in her features, he started to doubt. A few years later, he found a letter Margaret had hidden, one from a man named Robert, apologizing for, what happened that night, and begging her to not keep the baby unless you're sure. He confronted her. She broke down. She admitted everything. She begged him to stay. And he did. Not because he forgave her, and not because he believed in some noble sacrifice. He stayed because he didn't want me growing up in a broken home, because he couldn't imagine only seeing me every other weekend, because he feared what Margaret would become if he wasn't there to balance her out. He said he tried to love Emma as his own, and in some ways he did, but it was never the same. And Margaret, in her guilt and her need to rewrite the past, began favoring Emma, building her up, protecting her fiercely, and in doing so, punishing me, as if I were the living proof of the lie she could never quite erase. The letter ended with him saying he didn't know what the right thing to do had been, and that maybe there never was one. But he hoped that one day I would understand why he stayed silent, and he begged me not to let this truth destroy what little was left of our family, unless, and this part was underlined, unless the lie was continuing to hurt me, in which case, I had every right to do what he never could, speak. I sat on the attic floor for a long time after that, the letter still trembling in my hands, surrounded by broken picture frames and rusted screwdrivers and boxes, filled with the kind of junk people save only when they're avoiding the real mess. And I realized, with a calm that felt almost terrifying, that this wasn't just a sad story, it was ammunition. It was context. It was the missing puzzle piece that explained why I had spent my life trying to prove myself to a woman who had already decided, long ago, that I would never be good enough. Because loving me meant admitting she had done something wrong, something unforgivable, and instead of owning that, she chose to turn me into the problem. That night, I didn't go home right away. I drove around for hours, aimless, not ready to face the silence of my apartment, not ready to sit alone with the weight of what I now knew. I ended up parked outside an all-night diner, sipping bad coffee and replaying every childhood memory through a new lens, one that made everything sharper, uglier, and more painful. The time I broke my arm at the playground and she told me I was being dramatic. The Christmas I didn't get the art set I wanted because Emma really needed that new phone. The high school graduation where I stood on the stage, scanning the crowd for her face, only to see her taking pictures of Emma in the bleachers. The favoritism hadn't been subtle. It had been brutal, unapologetic, and constant. And now I understood it had never been about me not being enough, it was about me being too much of a reminder. I made copies of the letter the next morning. I scanned it, emailed it to a lawyer I knew through work, someone discreet and experienced with family cases. I asked him to verify the handwriting, date the ink, and validate the signature with old documents. I didn't want Margaret to have any room to call this fake or manufactured. I wanted the truth to hit like a freight train. Then I sat down and wrote something of my own. Just a few words, carefully chosen, printed in bold ink and stapled to the back of my father's letter. Truth should never be buried. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I was the one holding the narrative. Not her. Not Emma. Not anyone else who had looked at me like I was just the bitter older sister with a chip on her shoulder. Now I wasn't just the forgotten daughter. I was the one with the story. And I was ready to tell it. There's a very specific kind of dread that comes not in moments of catastrophe, but in the slow, creeping anticipation of confrontation, when you know something irreversible is about to happen and yet, you walk toward it anyway, step by deliberate step. Like a soldier knowing full well that the landmine is there, that the ground is ready to split beneath your feet, but choosing to keep marching forward, not out of bravery exactly, but out of a tired, smoldering refusal to keep playing along with the charade. That was the exact feeling I carried with me the day of Margaret's birthday party, as I stood in front of my closet, staring at my options like the right dress might somehow make this whole thing feel normal. Like there could possibly be a version of this night where anything felt light or celebratory or safe. I settled on a deep navy blue, long sleeves, modest neckline, the kind of thing that wouldn't invite compliments, but wouldn't invite questions either, the kind of dress you wear when you want to look invisible without looking like you're hiding. I clipped my hair back, put on a pair of earrings my father had given me for my college graduation, small silver hoops that had meant nothing at the time, but suddenly felt like armor. And then I tucked the envelope into my bag, the same one I had been carrying for weeks, always close, always within reach, like a loaded weapon I wasn't sure I'd ever actually use. I had told myself that I didn't have to go through with it, that the truth was mine and mine alone, and I could just sit on it forever if I wanted, that healing didn't have to be public or theatrical. But deep down, I already knew I had made the decision the second Margaret sent out the invitation with the line, "No gifts, just your presence and your praise." The venue was exactly what I expected, a rented banquet room at a pretentious country club with too many chandeliers and not enough personality, filled with round tables dressed in cream linens, each centerpiece more elaborate than the last. Like someone had tried to outflower the previous bouquet in a competition no one asked for. The guests were a blend of extended family, old neighbors, church acquaintances, and former colleagues of Margaret's who all looked like they had been invited not because they mattered, but because their attendance would look good in photos. Emma, of course, was already there, flitting between tables in a dress that shimmered subtly under the warm lights, all soft hair and gracious smiles, hugging distant cousins and thanking strangers for coming, like she was the goddamn hostess instead of the guest. She saw me and lit up, genuinely, I think, her arms outstretched as she came over to hug me, her eyes crinkling at the corners the way they always did when she was trying to make everything feel normal. And for a second, just a flicker, I almost believed it could be. That maybe the letter didn't matter, or maybe it did, but not enough to detonate it here, in this room full of people sipping champagne and talking about gardening. Maybe I could take her aside, tell her privately, give her the truth with the kind of softness I'd always wished someone had shown me. But then I saw Margaret. She was standing near the bar, surrounded by admirers, dressed in deep burgundy with a necklace that probably cost more than my rent, her glass already half empty, her laughter too loud, too rehearsed. She caught my eye and gave me that familiar smile, the one that didn't reach her eyes, the one that always meant she was tolerating me, the one that said, "Aren't you glad I invited you?" And just like that, the flicker was gone. I took my seat at the far end of the family table, the one next to the kitchen doors, the one where the servers would bump into my chair all night, the one she'd reserved for me. Emma sat next to Margaret, of course, her place card decorated with a gold ribbon. Mine was just printed, misspelled. I stared at my untouched bread plate, my hand resting lightly on my purse, feeling the envelope beneath the fabric like it had a pulse. Dinner dragged on in a haze of fake stories and forced laughter. People stood up to toast her one by one, her bridge partner, her cousin Carol, her former boss, each one painting a picture of a woman I barely recognized, a woman full of generosity and wit and warmth. I sat through it all, nodding, smiling when appropriate, trying not to scream. I waited. And then, finally, it came. Margaret stood, tapping her glass with a fork in that dainty, entitled way she did everything, as if the world owed her attention on command. The room quieted instantly. She looked around, soaking it in, and then she turned to Emma, placing a hand on her shoulder. "I just want to say," she began, her voice clear and smug, "that in my 70 years on this earth, my greatest joy, my greatest pride, has been being a mother to this incredible young woman beside me." There were soft ahs from the crowd, a few nods. "To my favorite child," she continued, lifting her glass, "the one worth celebrating." The silence that followed wasn't total. A few polite laughs, some scattered applause, but it was enough. Enough for me to feel the heat rising in my chest. Enough to know that if I didn't act now, I never would. I stood up. There was a murmur, a few curious glances. I didn't say a word as I walked across the floor, each step echoing louder in my ears than the ambient music or the rustling of napkins. I reached into my bag and pulled out the envelope, the one with the truth inside it, the one that had been burning a hole in my life for weeks. I handed it to her, slowly, deliberately, and leaned in just enough for my voice to carry. "Then this must be yours," I said, not bitter, not loud, just steady. And for a moment, she smiled, as if I were giving her a card, or maybe a late gift, something sentimental and sweet. But then she opened it. Her eyes moved quickly at first, scanning, then slower, pausing, narrowing. Her mouth twitched, her smile faltering like a power outage, flickering just before the blackout. She looked up at me, not confused, not angry, but terrified. And then she dropped her glass. For the first few seconds after the wine glass shattered on the polished wooden floor, time didn't just slow down, it fractured entirely, like someone had cracked the lens of the evening and now we were all suspended inside it, unable to move or breathe or even blink as the sound echoed across the banquet hall, louder and more violent than it had any right to be. The liquid spread in a crimson arc beneath Margaret's shoes, seeping into the cream-colored carpet that probably cost more than my first car, while her hand, still trembling slightly, gripped the opened letter with a force that turned her knuckles white. She didn't say anything, and neither did I, because the moment didn't need words, not yet. It was the kind of moment where silence speaks louder than outrage, where everyone in the room suddenly realizes they're not just at a party anymore, but at the epicenter of something raw and real and impossible to unsee. Emma was the first to move, though it wasn't much, just a sharp inhale, followed by the quietest whisper of my name, like she was trying to make sense of what was happening without alerting the crowd that her perfect world was beginning to unravel. The guests, all these distant relatives and curated friends, shifted in their seats, eyes darting between me and my mother, the atmosphere thick with that peculiar tension that comes when people aren't sure whether to intervene or pretend they saw nothing at all. It was almost comical, in a way, watching them all try to keep sipping their drinks, trying to smooth down their dresses or fiddle with their cutlery, desperate for a distraction that didn't exist. But no one looked at Margaret, not directly. Everyone was waiting for her to say something, to restore the performance, to laugh it off with one of her practiced quips and charm the air back into the room. But Margaret, for once in her life, had nothing to say. She just stood there, shoulders slowly pulling inward like she was trying to make herself smaller, like if she curled in far enough, the truth wouldn't touch her. Her lips moved slightly, but no sound came out, and that was when I knew I had done something far bigger than what I'd intended. I hadn't just exposed her secret, I had dismantled the scaffolding of her identity, the carefully constructed lie that held up every interaction she'd ever orchestrated in this family. And then she looked at me. It wasn't the cold, dismissive stare I was used to, the one that said, "You're being difficult again," or "You're making a scene," or "Can't you just let things go?" No, this was something else entirely. This was fear. Pure, unfiltered, animal fear, the kind that sits just behind the eyes when a person realizes they're no longer in control, when the mask slips and there's nothing left to hide behind. I should have felt triumphant. I should have felt vindicated, maybe even powerful. But what I felt in that moment wasn't any of those things. What I felt was clarity, the cold, unflinching kind that shows up when the fog finally lifts and you can see just how twisted the road behind you really was. Emma reached for the letter, her voice shaking as she asked, almost pleading, "What is this?" Margaret didn't stop her, didn't snatch it back, just let her take it like she'd already given up the right to control who knew what. Emma scanned the first page, then the second, and her face changed in a way I will never forget, not because of the tears that welled up in her eyes or the color that drained from her cheeks, but because she looked up at me not with betrayal or fury, but with confusion, deep and gutting, like someone who had just realized they'd spent their entire life reading from the wrong script. "You knew," she whispered to our mother, her voice rising ever so slightly, enough to make the nearby tables flinch. "All these years you knew?" Margaret didn't answer, not with words. She simply closed her eyes for a second, as if she could somehow unread the letter, unhear the question, unlive the moment. But it was already done. Emma's next words came sharper, louder. "So everything, all of it, was a lie?" Margaret finally spoke then, her voice low and brittle, like glass underfoot. "I did what I had to do," she said, "and it was the wrong thing to say, the worst thing to say, because that sentence wasn't an apology or an explanation, it was a justification. The same kind of warped logic she had used her entire life to excuse every favoritism, every manipulation, every cold dismissal. Emma deserved better than the truth, she added, and that was it, the match to the gasoline. Emma stood up so fast her chair toppled backward, the sound sharp and jarring. "You don't get to decide that," she snapped. "You don't get to lie and then act like it was some kind of kindness." The room was officially broken now. There was no salvaging it. Someone from the club staff stepped in awkwardly, mumbling something about checking the carpet, and Margaret waved them off with a look that could still cut through bone, even in her unraveling. I watched Emma storm out, her heels clicking furiously against the hardwood, the letter still clutched in her hand like it was radioactive. No one stopped her. Not one person said a word. They just watched her go, some with pity, some with confusion, most with the kind of blank faces people wear when they know they've just seen something intimate and ugly and entirely too real for a dinner party. Margaret sat down slowly, her body folding into the chair like someone had deflated her from the inside out. She didn't look at me again. Then, without warning, her hand went to her chest. Her breath hitched. Her face tightened. And before anyone could fully process what was happening, she collapsed forward against the table. Panic erupted. Someone shouted for a doctor. A woman screamed. A waiter dropped a tray. I didn't move. I stood there, frozen, watching the chaos unfold, watching my mother being surrounded by people who still believed in her fragility, who still rushed to save her even now, even after everything. And as the paramedics arrived and guests were ushered aside and questions were shouted over flashing lights, I kept thinking one thing, over and over again: they were still protecting her. Even as she fell, even as the truth spilled across the floor like broken glass and red wine, they still rushed to clean it up. The hospital smelled like disinfectant and something heavier underneath, a quiet, almost metallic odor that clung to the walls and seeped into your clothes if you stayed too long, the kind of scent that made people speak in hushed voices and keep their movements small, as if loud footsteps or full breaths might tip the balance between life and death. I sat in the beige waiting room with its cracked vinyl chairs and flickering overhead lights, staring at a vending machine I wasn't hungry for and trying to figure out if I felt anything resembling regret. Margaret was alive, stabilized within the hour, a mild cardiac event. The doctors called it nothing fatal, nothing dramatic enough to make this whole evening feel like it had consequence in the traditional sense. She would recover. She would go home. And the only thing that would remain broken beyond repair was the narrative she had spent her life constructing like a monument to her own fiction. I didn't go in to see her. Not because I wanted to punish her, not even because I was angry anymore, but because there was nothing left to say that wouldn't come out warped, soaked in too many years of withheld truths and silent screaming. Some things can't be fixed in the aftermath, and sometimes, what looks like reconciliation is just another performance, one I had finally, fully stepped away from. Emma sat across from me for a long time without speaking, her mascara smudged beneath her eyes, her hair pulled back in a loose, uncharacteristically messy bun that told me everything I needed to know about where she was emotionally. She looked like someone who had been dropped into a story she never meant to be part of, and I realized, not without a strange, aching sympathy, that while I had spent my entire life navigating the storm of being the daughter not quite loved, she had spent hers trapped inside a role she didn't choose either, the daughter worshipped not for who she was, but for who our mother needed her to be. The truth hadn't just shattered Margaret, it had gutted Emma too, and though part of me wanted to be cold, to point a finger and say, "Now you see," I couldn't bring myself to weaponize the moment. We had both been used. Just differently. After what felt like an hour of silence, Emma finally spoke, her voice hoarse from either tears or exhaustion, maybe both. "She lied to me my whole life," she said, not as a question, not seeking affirmation, but as a statement of fact, one she was still struggling to swallow. Everything, birthdays, holidays, every time she told me I reminded her of Dad, all of it was fake. I didn't correct her. I didn't tell her that some of it might have been real, that our mother had likely told herself the lies so often she started believing them, that she had constructed an entire mythology around her guilt and shaped us into symbols instead of daughters. I just said the only thing I could without unraveling the thread again. She lied to both of us. Emma nodded slowly, and for a long time, neither of us spoke. It was the first silence between us that didn't feel loaded or defensive. It just was bare, honest, and necessary. Days passed. The party, of course, became legend among the family. Some cousins called to check in, not so much to offer comfort as to sniff around for gossip, tiptoeing around the subject like if they asked directly, they'd be pulled into the fallout. A few tried to blame me, said I should have handled it privately, said I'd humiliated her in front of everyone she loved. But others, quiet, steady voices I hadn't expected, called to say they'd always sensed something off, that Margaret had never treated me quite right, that maybe it was time someone finally pulled the mask off. Emma didn't reach out after that first hospital night, not for almost 2 weeks, and I didn't push it. We both needed space to sift through the debris of what we'd learned, to figure out who we were now that the scaffolding had collapsed. But when she did call, her voice was different. Clearer. Softer, somehow. "I want to see Dad," she said, and I didn't need her to clarify. She meant the grave, not the man. "I stood there for an hour," she continued, just talking like an idiot. "I don't know why. He wasn't even really my father, and yet, it still felt like I owed him something." "You don't owe him anything," I replied, but even as I said it, I understood exactly why she had gone. We all wanted someone to tell us where we came from. We all wanted a version of family that didn't make us feel like strangers inside our own story. "I'm sorry," she said next, and that was the part that caught me off guard. Not just for what she did. For all the times I believed her. For not seeing what was happening to you. It would have been easy to reject the apology, to say it was too late, to guard myself with the same armor I'd worn for years. But I didn't. Because for once, it didn't feel performative. It felt earned. "Me too," I said, and that was the beginning of something, not quite a rebuilding. We weren't those kinds of sisters, maybe never would be, but a reckoning. A truce. A week later, a letter arrived in my mailbox, unmarked envelope, no return address. I knew it was from Margaret before I opened it. The weight of it was familiar, as was the neat, exacting cursive I'd seen on countless birthday cards and school permission slips. It wasn't long. It wasn't even an apology. Just 4 words. "You were always right." There was no explanation, no emotional punctuation, no attempt at reconciliation. Just a final, heavy admission that I hadn't imagined it all, that my pain had not been some dramatic overreaction, that the years I spent clawing at the edges of my own family's approval were not just shadows in my mind. I stared at those words for a long time, unsure whether to laugh or cry or scream, but in the end, I just folded the paper once, twice, 3 times, walked it to the fireplace, and set it on fire. I watched the flame curl the edges, watched the ink disappear into ash, and felt, not triumph, not peace, but release, quiet and slow and enough. People think revenge is a loud thing, a vengeful thing, a dramatic blow struck in fury, but sometimes, it's as simple as handing someone the truth and watching what they do with it. Sometimes, the most powerful revenge is to finally be seen, not through the lens someone else crafted for you, not through the distorted funhouse mirror of guilt and denial, but as you are, scars and all. And if Margaret wanted to believe that final note was a concession, a moment of humility, she could have it. Let her think it mattered. I didn't need it anymore. Because I didn't do it for her. I did it for the little girl who stood on Christmas morning holding a broken toy while her sister unwrapped jewelry, for the teenager who stopped bringing home good news because she knew it wouldn't be celebrated, for the woman who walked through life believing she was somehow fundamentally unlovable because her own mother couldn't love her without flinching. I did it because truth, when wielded carefully, can be the most elegant form of liberation. And maybe, just maybe, because after 43 years, I finally believed it myself. I was the one worth celebrating.